So we're now going to, so we're now going to introduce ourselves. My name is Renee James, and I'm the curator for Greater Arizona Collection here at ASU.
Hi, my name is Vina Begay, and I am the assistant librarian and the archivist for the Labriola National American Indian Data Center.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cummins, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona. And I started as an intern and am now a contractor at Labriola, and I've been there since summer of 2023.
So before ASU likes to acknowledge that Arizona State University sits on the ancestral lands of Akmil Adim and Peepash people. And the ASU library likes to advocate and also incorporate the incorporation of the Indigenous knowledge system and research methodologies within our contemporary and library practices.
Okay, so this is our agenda for today's presentation. We're going to be talking about Greater Arizona and Labriola collections, an overview and also specific collections. We'll be examining Greater Arizona and Labriola collaboration, protocols for Native American Archival Materials, or PNAAM, reparative justice and actions, and archival reparative descriptions actions. Next slide, please. So the back one. Thank you. The Greater Arizona Collection is a part of ASU's Community-Driven Archives Initiative, or CDA, and includes CDA strategies such as diversifying the historical record and implementing descriptive and reparative actions. Next slide. So there are over 500 collections in the Greater Arizona Collection. The collections are comprised of published and unpublished materials in all formats, including primary and secondary resources that document the history of Arizona and the Southwest. Collection materials include personal papers, organizational and business records, congressional and political papers, and a myriad of resource materials on Arizona and the Southwest, with a number of collections containing Indigenous content. Legacy collections were acquired over the past decades and tend to be less inclusive or taken from communities without partnering. These continue to be managed, but collecting scope guidelines now prioritize marginalized and BIPOC communities. Next slide, please. The bulk of collections date to the 20th and 21st centuries, with a focus specifically on Central Arizona and Phoenix. Subjects and specialized topics include political history, Arizona and Phoenix history, water and land management, mining and labor history, community-driven history, and business and organizational histories. Next slide, please. In addition to the Greater Arizona Collection, the Community-Driven Archives Department includes curators for the Chicano Research Collection, Black Collections, and University Archives, and a director of the department, an archivist for collections arrangement and description, a CDA archivist, and an archive specialist. Next slide, please. So this is just a small part of CDA vision, mission, and programming. In addition to diversifying the historical record, CDA initiatives empower community members to preserve and manage their own histories. And in particular, initiatives support the development of collaborative programming to address repair actions in collections and descriptive content, such as collections with Indigenous content. CDA initiatives also enhance teaching and learning experiences by supporting students, staff, and faculty with culturally and socially diverse resources, programs, and services. Next.
Hi, and now I will be discussing about the Labriola National American Indian Data Center, or Labriola for short is what we used, and who our team is and our mission. So Labriola was established in 1993, and it was geared to support Indigenous scholar and faculty, in which they mostly centered their collections around Indigenous scholarships, faculty work, and it was managed under non-Indigenous professional staff. Most recently, in 2022, the Labriola Center became an all-Indigenous staff, with members, including myself, have strong connections to our tribal community, connectivity, and our traditional practices of our culture and our teachings. Alex Soto is the library director for Labriola. He's also the assistant librarian, and he comes from the To'ana Nation, and Eric and Utazba are our program coordinators, and they are from the Diné Nation, including myself. So our new team mobilized together to restructure Labriola's strategy, mission, and commitment in servicing our Indigenous ASU community and our surrounding tribal nations community in here in Arizona. Labriola implements an Indigenous librarianship and archival framework of our Indigenous knowledge system and cultural protocols as the core. We uphold and respect our tribal and cultural sovereignty. Therefore, we emphasize on cultural property rights over individual copyright within our collections and Indigenous with research information as well. Labriola provides a cultural safe space for our ASU Indigenous community of students, faculty, staff, and tribal communities members while engaging with our library and archival materials. Lastly, we center our Indigenous way of knowing through oral engagement, and that's what Utazba and Eric's role are, and towards revitalization, reclamation, healing. And Labriola's slogan is, information is sacred, because a lot of these information documented in the library and archives collections are literally traditional knowledge and are deemed sacred to the tribal nations. So before Labriola's restructuring, Labriola's collection again was only tailored towards scholarly materials, but they also little concentration on archival collections. But we do have some collections dealing with all the collections that were Indigenous end up going to Renee's collection, which is the Greater Arizona. So we only have very few Indigenous archive related materials under Labriola. And currently, Labriola only consists of 50 processed manuscripts collections and approximately 10 unprocessed. So our collection right now consists of tribal newspapers coming from various communities, mostly in Arizona. And a few out of state, we do have some Eastern tribal newspapers from that community there. Our ephemera collections consist of duplicates from existing collections, individual item donations, brochures, newsletters, and tribal meeting notes. Our distinctive collection is our special collections of rare books, publications from tribal communities, and historical out-of-print books and books signed by the author. For most of our archival collections across all repository, a lot of those collections are coming from a historical aspects and rarely focus on in present day Indigenous communities. So it's one of Labriola's goals to collect contemporary collections from Indigenous people to show how that we are still here. At Labriola, we prioritize to process collection and highlight our contemporary Indigenous archival collections as well. The following collections are tribal community members and leaders who make impactful changes for Arizona Indigenous communities. These individuals were pivotal in making social changes for Indigenous people through activism, political positions, and writing, also advocating work among queer and transgender Indigenous communities. Arizona is home to 22 tribal nations. However, the Hachadodem community is currently seeking recognition as a sovereign nation and federal recognition. Labriola recognizes the Hachadodem as the 23rd tribal nation in Arizona. As mentioned earlier, all tribal archival collections within these 22 tribal nations fell under the Greater Arizona. And with the restructuring of Labriola's emphasis of Indigenous cultural protocols and leading the implementation of PNAAM across the ASU libraries, with Labriola's new strategic mission, along with ASU's library mission of incorporating these Indigenous knowledge system, Renee and I have collaborated in ensuring the respectfulness of proper cultural stewardship of these Indigenous information. And this collaborative work involves collection review and transferring of Greater Arizona collections under Labriola. So our collaborative work focused heavily on implementing protocols of Native American Archival Materials, PNAAM for short, within our internal procedures. I will not go into detail, as many of you are probably aware of PNAAM. And if you are not familiar, I require you to all read and familiarize yourself with PNAAM, especially if you are managing Indigenous collections. However, I will say it has been around since 2007 and finally endorsed by Society of American Archivists in 2019. Sorry, there's a misprint there. PNAAM was created by Indigenous archivists, librarians, and Indigenous allies, advocating for the cultural respect and proper management of cultural and historical information of Indigenous people. So please keep in mind, these are not set standards, and they are only guidelines. Meaning one tribal community's protocol restrictions will not work for another tribal community within your archival collections. These procedures are defined and guided by the tribal nations represented in these collections. Only the internal process and procedures towards relationship building and communication with tribal communities should be standardized within your system. PNAAM supports tribal nation sovereignty and cultural rights towards information, ownership, cultural revitalization, connectivity, and accessibility. PNAAM's mission is respecting and protecting traditional knowledge found in books, audiovisual, photographs, documents, and digital resources, including protecting the spiritual and traumatic well-being of Indigenous people while accessing and doing consultation work. Lastly, PNAAM is to generate transparency and repair the tribal and Western institutions relationship. And I will pass it back to Renee.
Yes. So now we're going to be talking about reparative justice and action for Indigenous materials. Next slide. So I'm going to be presenting an overview of reparative general considerations. So there's a need to review and reevaluate the language used to describe collections and to view these descriptive conventions through a lens of inclusivity and reparative actions. Reparative description is an example of how archivists can prioritize a more accurate representation of communities in collections and in descriptive resources. The importance of initiating a reparative description initiative cannot be overstated, as many legacy descriptive practices include harmful, inaccurate, offensive, and outdated language based on a Western European tradition. We work toward and strive to have archival description that's ethical, inclusive, and community-driven, and develop descriptive metadata viewed through an intersectional lens and informed lived experience. This is an essential component to reparative initiatives and to reach out to community constituents and begin a conversation about preferred descriptive terms and actions. Contextualizing language is at the core of reparative description. In reviewing the descriptive resources, finding aids, for example, look for potentially harmful language, inaccurate descriptions, imprecise terms, omissions, outdated terms. This also concerns what may have been perceived to be neutral language associated with collections, particularly those that may omit explicit information or that do not offer context. For reparative actions, partner with communities and colleagues, create a glossary and guidelines for preferred terminology in consultation with community partners, and prioritize BIPOC collections such as those with Indigenous content. Next slide. So ASU's community-driven archives team, along with the Labriola Center, acknowledge the historical trauma of Indigenous communities. The Greater Arizona Collection observes the primary right of affiliated Indigenous communities and works within PNAAM guidelines. The protocols were adopted by ASU Library in 2019. And this began with administrative actions such as drafting PNAAM language for collection development policies and accession forms. In 2021, protocols language adopted for collection development policies is as follows. Relevant Native nations will be consulted regarding collecting any culturally sensitive material, and when the material was not created or donated directly by the Native nation or member. If advised by the affiliated Native nation, archival material will not be collected by ASU Library. And currently, we first contact the Labriola Center if there is Indigenous content in a potential donation so that they can review the collection and make recommendations on the disposition of those materials. And I want to be clear, new collections with Indigenous content are not and will not be acquired for inclusion in the Greater Arizona Collection. For all materials and inquiries that include Indigenous content, as Vina had mentioned, we partner to review, for example, Greater Arizona legacy collections that may contain culturally sensitive subjects or content that is restricted to the community, and then to determine the disposition of collections containing those materials. For example, when reference or research requests contain these kinds of materials, I review the request, and Vina is contacted so that items can be reviewed according to PNAAM guidelines and then restrict those that contain culturally sensitive or concerning subjects. I'm also working collaboratively with Vina to consider the disposition of these collections or items. Some options include repatriation or ethical return to the community, or to transfer those collections or materials to the Labriola Center so that Indigenous staff are managing those items. Next.
So the PNAAM protocol, as you all are familiar with, is the first one is building relationship of mutual respect. And relationship building is a continuous cycle of collaboration with tribal nations, and it's never ending. So under the building relationships of mutual respect, the guideline states inform Native communities about collections of relevant materials and explain the nature of the material, evaluate institutional holdings, and if a Native American collection is out of scope, transfer the collection to the community or to the closest archives at the tribe or the band's request. In order to fill these requests, and as non-Indigenous archivists handling Indigenous materials, please acknowledge you must educate and inform yourself of local tribal communities your institution is surrounding and servicing. By educating and informing yourself, it is not about learning our tribal nation's traditional knowledge in depth. It is about familiarizing the characteristics associated with cultural sensitivity with tribal nations in your regional area, such as hairstyle, clothing, language, music style, ceremonial locality. Some of tribal communities have ceremonials taking place outside or inside. Informing and educating yourself and being very attention to detail will help determine these culturally sensitive collection review process. As non-Indigenous archivists, please acknowledge that reparative actions go beyond description and is part of our archival ethical duty. So the reasons why we ask that is I often hear tribal communities, institutions will pull all these materials, expect them to do the work for them. So please identify these materials first before you reach out to communities. Part of the PNAAM initiative of relationship building requires being proactive by getting your library administration and leadership to support these PNAAM initiatives. Throughout our presentation, we will discuss our internal process for culturally sensitive review. So again, ASU supports PNAAM and also the Indigenous knowledge systems that we put in our land acknowledgement statement, and supports a lot of Labriola's initiatives. Due to Labriola's decolonial library and archival framework, along with its connectivity and positive relationship with tribal communities, Labriola Center provides PNAAM support and represents a tribal liaison between tribal nations and ASU libraries. Many of the Arizona tribal nations do not have an archival repository, so the direction is to place these collections under Labriola, since our procedures and our mission and our statement aligns with PNAAM. The alignment of building relationship of mutual respect requires building an internal community within your institution who is working with tribal communities, which may lead to looking outside of the library and archive. We had to establish for us with Renee and I, we had to establish our own ASU internal collaborative community within our organization. And this is where I work with every division or department manager to discuss these PNAAM goals and objectives, also to develop internal processes. and procedures. I don't work with Renee. I also work with other departments that emphasizes PNAAM. So that's a whole different panel discussion. Due to the high level work involved in cultural reviews and designing internal PNAAM procedures, I also had to get help from other Indigenous professionals or Indigenous allies who understand cultural and tribal sovereignty protocols. This is where I have contracted Jewel, and Jewel's background in Indigenous data sovereignty aligns with PNAAM and has assisted me in every aspect of the cultural review. And I will pass this on. We'll go to the next slide. Sorry. For the cultural review process, Jewel and I develop a form for archival collection review for the PNAAM because it has never been developed. And also to mention that as archivists, we love forms, forms for everything. So why not create another PNAAM cultural form? So Jewel will talk a little bit more of what that form is.
Yes, so as Vina mentioned, particularly from a Western perspective, information institutions love their paperwork, especially when documentation is needed for any changes made to collections, finding aids, arrangements, etc. And so this form was originally created in the first hour of my internship. We hit the ground running. We knew we needed to dive in and start somewhere with the document, even if we were building the plane as we flew it. So through using the collection review form, we've actually made some modifications to it, including adding an overall collection recommendation section where we can add things such as digitization or, anything along those lines. And so on this form, I just want to point out a few key sections. We will be showing examples of these. But first is the culturally restricted identified items section, which comes first, right? So of note is the description from finding aid. That is the description prior to any changes that are made to the finding aid. For example, the culturally restricted items may be in the reparative description section, which I'll talk about in a sec, but that is just the description that we initially have. And then the target community is actually based off of a few different things. It's based off of mostly, though, the review of the picture, because the description may be misleading or the community may be misidentified. And so the target tribal community is that which we have identified upon review. And finally, you'll see the cultural restriction recommendation is where we actually put our notes regarding any of the items that are culturally restricted. This could be items that need to be added to the finding aid. This could be internal notes. So really just any communication we need to have for that. And then second is the item reparative description. And this section contains those items that need to have their descriptions updated from what is currently stated in the finding aid. It also will potentially include items that may not originally be in the finding aid. And then you will also see a section for reparative recommendations, which again could be updates to the finding aid itself, additional language that needs to happen, or even internal notes. In both of these recommendation sections, we actually finalize the language. And so that way it's basically a copy and paste situation when I go and update the finding aid. And then the final section of note is the recommendation of transfer to Labriola. And so there's a space left for the reasoning. So this section was actually, I don't believe, originally on the collection review form when we originally created it, but it's become quite vital to the process, as Vina and Renee have alluded to. Because different collections are housed within different repositories, and those repositories may not be the appropriate location. And so the two questions that originally I was asked was, how much is restricted, and then how much pertains to Indigenous peoples or Indigenous communities. And so originally we didn't have a super specific answer to that. It was more majority, thinking along those lines. Now, however, as we've gone through more and more collections, doing a collection review, it's been decided that if 25% is restricted, or if 40% of the collection contains information or data about Indigenous individuals, topics, communities, then I recommend the transfer. And that's where I put the reasoning on this collection review form. So I will say, although this collection review form was partially initially created in order to satisfy the Western perspective of needs for documentation, it has been very handy for internal communications and for referencing back to collections. I referenced back to them when we were creating this presentation. So they have been very handy on a multitude of levels. And so, Vina?
So to begin our PNAAM work and procedures, Renee helped identify Greater Arizona's most requested Indigenous collections and a high percentage of the Indigenous focus for collections or cultural review. So which I will pass on to Renee to discuss these collections that we completed and are in process.
Thank you. So for the Simeon Schwemberger Southwest Mission photographs, they were acquired in 2005 from the St. Michael's Mission, which is in St. Michael's, Arizona. And a large selection of the glass plate negatives were scanned. And these images, the majority depict Indigenous communities, and they were taken by the Franciscan Brothers. And the dates, it's quite early, 1902 to 1909. I also wanted to mention that, of course, these are under review for culturally sensitive content, but prior to reparative review, these photographs were not restricted. They were freely accessed, and that will be the common factor in these Greater Arizona collections, that there were no restrictions and they were freely accessed. In addition to reviewing the images, reparative actions include a review of the finding aid for descriptive terms. And one example would be imprecise language. For example, a girl, a boy, a woman, a building. And while these terms are not offensive, they are inaccurate and disrespectful to these communities. Also, I want to mention, in addition, when this collection was first acquired, a large selection of the images were published in a catalog and distributed at a reception and an exhibit with no consideration for the communities represented. Jewel, you can talk about your review.
So Renee definitely gave me some heavy lifting right out of the gate with the review of this collection. It was actually, I believe, one of the first full ones that we reviewed. It happened over the course of several months, just because it was so big. Thankfully, the majority of the collection was actually digitized on a shared drive. So as mentioned, so I didn't have to handle the individual glass plate negatives. I have experience with handling them, prior work experience, but I was very, very thankful. And so of note, the descriptions in the finding aid were in alphabetical order, but the digitization was in numerical order. And so there was a lot of scrolling and flipping pages as I was going through the collection review. The printed finding aid is actually 95 pages long, because the Schwemberger collection is actually listed on an item level. It is not a box level. So to give you some examples of the review process and issues faced as I was doing the collection review, the descriptions that you see next to the pictures on the original description are some of the examples that I came across. For example, a baby in a cradle board, or a girl in quote unquote Indian costume sitting on rug. And so a new description or the new descriptions are actually a baby in a cradle board Diné Navajo, and then a Native American woman in traditional Anishinaabe or Anishinaabe regalia or clothing, Southwest shawl, and Southwest rug. Another example, and one that Renee alluded to, was children standing on steps, and it was actually Native American children or Native American school children standing on steps. And so fixing all of these descriptions, which I would say had to happen for about 3/4 of the collection, was a large portion of why the collection took so long to review. And then another issue with the descriptions was that approximately 50 of the items had the extremely helpful description of no description. And so it actually turns out that several of these items needed to be restricted. So it was a two-step process in that instance of figuring out what indeed was within it and then restricting when needed. Whenever possible with the reparative description, regardless of whether they were culturally restricted items or otherwise, the community was put into the description, just as you saw with the cradle board. And so this is particularly to push back against thinking of all Native Americans as a singular entity, singular community. Unfortunately, with the bulk of the collection, this was not possible because, as I mentioned, school children, they're in uniforms. And so there's not a whole lot of identifying features that we know for sure what community these, for example, the children could be from. Different aspects of the images that we used during the reparative descriptions to either discover or give an educated guess as to what community the individual or groups were from. I believe Vina mentioned some of them. So there was beadwork, jewelry, hairstyle, the cradle boards, as you see on the slide, designs of clothing, as you see in the bottom picture. So all of those were used. And yes, I learned a lot and took copious notes regarding various things that could be indications for the communities, to identify the communities when going through the reparative description. And so once everything was finished, it was realized that once the reparative description was finished, the entire collection consists of or pertains to Indigenous community or communities, but less than 10% of it was restricted. However, because so much of it, where originally we were going with majority, was Indigenous individuals, communities, etc., I made the recommendation for the collection to be transferred from Greater Arizona to Labriola. And so I should also note, and this is very important, that we realized very early on, and it's still an ongoing process, is, as mentioned, the bulk of the Schwemberger collection is digitized, and this was a boon for me not having to handle the glass plate negatives, but it was definitely an uh-oh moment when we realized that restricted items were on the shared drive. So all of the digitizations of the various collections housed at ASU, at the large institution, are located on this shared drive and openly accessible to ASU and Labriola staff. This includes me being able to, I am in Tucson, I'm not in Phoenix. And so this includes me being able to use a VPN to access these images. And so ideally, we don't want to delete the digitized items that are restricted except in certain circumstances. And so we really had to discover how to move these items, which turns out to be a whole other process that needs to happen, which again, we're still working on, because part of it was figuring out who had the IT access and ability to actually move items on the shared drive. Which is not within necessarily the Labriola system or the larger library system. So again, it's still in process, but it was one of those things that arose as we were going through the collection review. Next slide. And so this is the top portion of the culturally restricted identified items of the Schwemberger collection review. So of note, the headings at the top of the table have been changed from the template because again, this is not organized in boxes and folders. This was item level list. And so again, modifying the collection review in order to make it work for us, adding what we needed, modifying what we needed with each individual collection review. And so I also want to point out that the Schwemberger collection review is actually more than 70 pages long because of how much, not just cultural restrictions, again, it was less than 10%, but because of how much reparative description had to happen. And so for these restricted items, some were already restricted within Schwemberger. So it was just a matter of confirming that what was described was actually what was in the picture and therefore needed to stay restricted. Some, as with the no description, I had to add the description and then restrict it. Then given the communities that were portrayed in these images, I also had to be very careful, and this was unfortunately a learning process for me. I had to be careful about who confirmed that some of these images needed to be restricted because, for example, Vina, I accidentally showed Vina a picture that she was not supposed to view. And so being very careful and getting very good at describing pictures to ensure that one, they may be able to take a look at it. And by they, I mean anybody that is helping or is involved in the project. And so I actually would flag, if I was doing the review off-site, I would just flag and then we would talk about it in person. We did it in bulk. So on this collection review portion, you'll see that some of the boxes are actually yellow. And that is because we are not sure about which community the picture is from. You'll see that some say unknown, and then some are in yellow. It was us trying to figure out how we wanted to move forward and indicate which ones were unknown. So the listed target tribal community indicates those communities we are either A, 100% sure of, or B, that we are fairly certain about, making those best guesses based off of the other clues, such as the stitching design, etc. And then the restricted added, you'll see also that that's a new column. That was really because the finding aid was so, or excuse me, the collection review form was so long that I wanted to make sure that I kept track. So you'll see that if restriction was added to the finding aid for this item, there's a yes. But again, going back to the digitization and figuring out what processes may or may not work for us, we actually created a spreadsheets that would be communicated to the person that needed to actually move the items in the shared drive into a restricted folder that has limited access. And so you'll see the second yes is because I added it to that spreadsheet for that person. I would also like to say that just because it is in the restricted section does not mean that it's not in the reparative description. Excuse me, just because it's not in the culturally restricted section does not mean it's not in the reparative description section. And so these just happen to be the descriptions originally before the reparative description. So they could be in both locations. And so one last item from this is that this is where we realized that we needed to have the overall recommendations, because while the bulk of the Schwemberger collection was digitized, it's not all digitized. And unfortunately, some of the finding aid items were, there's typos in them. So I don't actually know what they are. And so I made the recommendation to have the remainder of the glass plates digitized. And then once that's done, those items can be double checked for restrictions. and then the finding aid can be updated based on moving forward. And so, again, although the Schwemberger was listed on an item level, that's not always the case. So some of the future collections, you'll see there's a bit different. So next slide.
So before we go to the next slide, the reason why we have a targeted tribal community is because a lot of collections have a multiple tribal nations in these collections. So it helps us identify which tribal communities we have to contact and collaborate with. So during the collection review, we have to gather all these materials and possibly give tribal communities also a listing of our inventory. And if any of you are familiar with NAGPRA, kind of falls in that similar boat where we give them an inventory of that. And a lot of these fate of these materials will be determined when we're working with tribal communities. So once we finish the review, we provide recommendations as the end, as Joel has mentioned. And all of this falls under the PNAAM guidelines of culturally sensitive. We're gearing to that next step where we already gathered so much materials for the tribal community without having to have them do the work, as most institutions like to do. And again, going through that transfer to determining, is it 25% or more of culturally sensitive, and then 40% if it's Indigenous focus, which will go into Labriola. So, and then I will have Renee talk about Arizona Views.
Yes, thank you. So Arizona Views is an artificial collection, and it's divided into many different sections. Each section has a number associated with it and a CP-SPC unique identifier. Many different subjects included. The bulk of accessions were made 1993 to 94. And of course, the section that we're highlighting here, Arizona Views 24, houses photographs with Indigenous subjects. But I want to mention there's also additional Arizona Views that also contain Indigenous communities. Jewel?
Yeah, so Arizona Views was, I believe, the first one for the artificial collection that I reviewed. But we only, and by we, I mean it was actually Vina and I that did this in person. We inspected 86 inspection prints. And so based off of the descriptions from there, we either kept restrictions on items or added. We just really, the inspection prints really gave us a way to figure out how things were described within the collection. So it gave us red flags for the rest. The remainder of the collection we could not do in person. Some were fragile, some were precarious. So that's why we did it based off of the 86 inspection prints and then going from there. This collection did not need the level of reparative description that the Schwemberger collection did, because it was not only because it was smaller, but I also would like to say regarding this collection, one of the things that we came across was that only a handful of the collection were digitized. And from those that were digitized, not all of them were on the finding aid. So again, this lack of consistency between the two was another reason why we chose to do the inspection prints in person. So next slide. And so this is the start of the collection review form for Arizona Views 24. You'll see there's only 3 culturally restricted items, much less than Schwemberger, but you will see in the item reparative description, the first line, this is actually the picture from the previous slide. So the current description is actually that it's not in the finding aid. And so that is the new description that I added. You will also see on the 3rd row down with item number 8, and then the 6th row down on item number 31, the words that I look for when I'm doing a collection review. I will admit I do a Control F because I don't want to miss any of those as I'm flipping between multiple different things. So that tends to be something that I do immediately and flag those items. As well, this review form provides, although it's not shown on the slide, it provides a more holistic view or holistic example of the use of the collection review form, because I made the recommendation that the remainder of the collection be made into inspection prints. Once that happens, then the finding aid can be further updated upon the rest of the collection being reviewed. So next slide.
So another part of doing collection, a culturally sensitive review, is handling incoming research requests coming in real time. This procedure also identifies questions you may have with tribal communities to assist with this third protocol under the PNAAM, which is accessibility and use, that will get into the tribal nations collaboration. So we get a lot of incoming requests for the greater Arizona for Indigenous material. And we created a quick guide focusing on descriptions found on the finding aid. This quick guide is for our staff handling a lot of our Ask an Archivist requests for researchers wanting to view these materials, and also our distinctive collections. So with this guide, I've also trained a lot of our library staff on what PNAAM looks like and what this guide entails and what to look for in the finding aid. In the yellow box is a cautionary warning box that tells you, any subject headings dealing with, as our normal Indians of North America, start, putting your ears up, and then determine what the description is, right? So we have Arizona tribal collections. So we put the historical name that a lot of tribal communities are referred to, but we also include the tribal traditional names that a lot of tribal communities refer themselves. We also have a lot of different outside of Arizona tribal nations, other North American tribal nations in our collection. They are also in there. It's not comprehensive, so it's a case-by-case basis in that sense. So as our staff are looking at the finding aid and the description, if any of these materials fall into the red box, which you see a lot of them are a lot of the culturally sensitive information descriptions, then they go into that, they flag it, then they reach out to Labriola, and which Labriola will review. If any of these descriptions fall into the green box where it's just reservation life, boarding school systems, oftentimes a lot of these do not carry a lot of culturally sensitive information, but sometimes we do miss it. It's not 100% proof. So if Renee feels like it still needs review, she'll flag it anyway and let me know, and I will go out there and review it. And after reviewing numerous collections, we found some of these descriptions that are not commonly used from past ASU archivists, which we end up having to update a lot of these descriptions. So right now what you see is our first version. We do have a list of all the other descriptions that has been used in the past and that we've seen across in finding aids. So, and then I will pass it on to Renee to discuss what that real-time requests for our collections.
And I would add that the quick reference sheet that Vina developed has been so helpful. It also frees up Vina so that if there are very clearly non-restricted materials, that they don't have to be reviewed. So it's been really helpful. To actually on my board to my right, and I refer to it often. So let's talk about the next collection that's in the Greater Arizona collection, and that's the Frank Midvale papers. And we've been talking about photos and descriptive terms. The issue with this collection is primarily maps. The Frank Midvale papers house a variety of different kinds of materials: correspondence, manuscripts, notes, photographs, documenting Midvale's archaeological work. And we received this collection in 1997 from ASU's Department of Anthropology. So that's a provenance. There are culturally sensitive materials that are directly related to the maps that are in the collection, because they identify Indigenous locations of burials and culturally sensitive items. I also just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges with request, and particularly this collection. When a number of researchers, and there were several, were informed of PNAAM restrictions for maps in this collection, They pushed back and did not want to accept the restrictions. They went to great lengths to gain access, including contacting different colleagues within the library's distinctive collections. However, colleagues were in communication about the request and worked together to ensure that the PNAAM restrictions were observed. And I think that's sort of a common tactic. They don't realize we actually are colleagues and communicate with one another. And, you know, we take this very seriously. It's something that we're dedicated to. So yeah, so that's happens with researchers. And because this collection was freely accessible prior, a lot of times they'll use that as a basis for current access, that, well, you know, it's been, you know, available previously. Jewel?
Yeah, the only thing, because I know we're running a little short on time. So the only thing that I would add is that this is an example of a better safe than sorry situation. So some of the maps were very obvious that we needed to restrict. Others were not obvious. For example, they were labeled prehistoric irrigation. And because no one that was reviewing the maps at the time knew that were from those communities, we did not know whether or not the communities would want them restricted. So it's always better to restrict rather than cause future harm by viewing. So next slide.
So just to add to Renee with the researcher requests on our end, what we deal with too, with researchers feeling that they have a right to this information, is that they also try to find every way to maneuver and navigate through that, because they tried to go bypass Renee, but we already trained our staff. Everything that ends up coming to Labriola, and a lot of Labriola has received a lot of pushbacks from these researchers demanding to see these materials. And they even tried throwing ASU's mission against us. And then we had our own mission as Labriola, why we're doing what we're doing. And that kind of just ended the conversation, and also included our director to advocate for that and make that statement towards our researchers. So just something to keep in mind, just being proactive and stand your ground, because it is your institution's reputation among tribal nations that is on the line.
Okay, so the Sammy Jones photographs were donated in 1979 by the donor Sammy Jones. And again, these photographs contain culturally sensitive content. I wanted to highlight two in particular. So this collection includes an image of mutilation and a hanging, both depicting individuals from the San Carlos community. These are difficult and disturbing images to view. Emotional fatigue and trauma is a very real result of working on projects that include this kind of traumatic and harmful content. So obviously it's important to be supportive of one another and to establish a safe space in the workplace. Jewel?
Yeah, so this is a collection that I have not reviewed in person. As mentioned, we already know that there are some significant culturally restricted items within this collection, with the mutilation and the hanging. So it is a benefit because some of these items are not ones that, for example, Vina can view. So there is an example of bringing me in. Vina and I have had frank conversations about me viewing this collection. But one of the big things with this collection is, just as with the Arizona Views 24, this collection has even more items that are missing from the finding aid. So given the possibility of what can be included within these collections, we have to view every item within it. And so it may take additional time. We just don't know. But of note as well, within this collection, we are actually we're planning on rearranging it so that all culturally sensitive items are in a single location, so that there's no chance of accidental viewing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with the next collection that we discuss. But because of the sensitive nature of some of these photographs beyond from the other examples of culturally restricted, there will be a disclaimer for the communities prior to them viewing this collection. And by communities, I mean Indigenous communities. Vina?
Yeah, and I also want to add, this is an example of why it's important for archivists to do their due diligence of reviewing their collections before reaching out to tribal communities because of these horrific photographs. This collection was requested by a non-Indigenous researcher who mentioned in his request that he was bringing a San Carlos member to view these materials. So on a different note too, this collection also required help, as Renee and Jewel has mentioned. There's a lot of cultural taboos that I can't look at. So a lot of these images were also for my spiritual well-being, and just also looking out for those, a lot of our tribal community who's are traditional practicing as well. So for the one that we're talking about, the rearrangement is the Laura Tohi. This is not a Greater Arizona collection, but it is a Labriola. And this material is a Lori Tohi collection. It's papers in Indigenous faculty here, that she was a faculty, she's also a writer, contained a lot of community oral histories, containing traditional knowledge, and there was cultural restrictions. So this box had 4 boxes in total. And when we reviewed it, after those cultural restrictions placed into 1 box, that led to 5 boxes. And I'll have Jewel talk about the finding aid, or talk a little bit more about the collection.
Yeah, so this collection, really, there's 2 things that I want to talk about. First is you will see on the finding aid on Arizona Archives Online that there's a note for some of the items that will say removed and placed in box 5, folder 1. That is a nod to original order, and just making sure that people knew where it had originally fallen within the collection. I will say it is not possible to sometimes to do that, depending on what format the information or data is in, but whenever possible, that's the practice. The only other of note on the collection review form is I made the recommendation that there was some outdated technology, quote unquote, outdated technology, that at the time that we were reviewing the collection, we didn't have access to, so we couldn't view them. So there's some VHS and reel-to-reel that I actually recommend to be digitized. So next slide.
So just a little side note on Indigenous cultural information should be treated as such as a donor request when they're applying restrictions. Only for Indigenous information. You know, tribal nations are their governing communities. They are a sovereign nation, and they will dictate what is restricted according to their cultural and research information. And this also reflects towards tribal nations' cultural property and sovereignty rights. It's really not up to the non-tribal creator to determine these cultural restrictions. And also tribal nations information is often should be credited in these collections, and white creators should not be considered copyright owners. Please consider using the terminology contributor, because these cultural information do belong to a community. Just something to add to, and this is only for Indigenous information. And if Jewel wants to add more to the finding aid, do you want to add more?
No, I just want to note that for the access restriction, you'll see that the boxes and then quote unquote all maps, it's from the Frank Midvale collection. And so it's not always at the item level, right, that they are organized. Sometimes it's the boxes. We don't list the items that are restricted. For example, the Schwemberger collection, it's not practical to list all of those. So those restrictions are at the item level, but whenever possible, we do add it to this general restrictions comment.
So once we have a good amount, so what's the next step for ASU libraries in the PNAAM process? Once we have a good amount of materials gathering, Labriola will work with these tribal communities to discuss what information that we have that belongs to their community. And in that discussion, in that conversation, they'll provide consent, review, how it could also lead into repatriation, right? So a lot of our internal, whatever we communicated, especially with MOUs, MOAs, what's discussed between the institution and tribal nation, that will reflect into our deed of gift. And also revising a lot of our cultural scope collections. And that's something where I recommend all Western institution is not just to accept any Native American collection into your repository, because this does impact tribal communities having to reach out to going outside of their regional area. And also in terms of it impedes accessibility. Also, we are working towards the tribal authorization form in the research and reading rooms, duplication forms to reflect a lot of these PNAAM stuff. And also in real time, what we do for incoming archival donations, we are using this term. We updated our deed of gift, which reflects a little tiny, in yellow you see here, addressing those cultural sensitivity issues found in collections. So this is in real time. We haven't gotten in touch with the tribal community, but this is just to inform the donors. This is what's going to happen if we do find anything in their collection. And also, if you are working with a tribal community and have an MOA or MOU, include those communication agreements in the deed of gift. Again, as I mentioned, if you're getting collections coming in, ask the donor specific questions. Does your collection contain Native American information? If so, are there any ceremonial information in there? You don't have to go into detail specifically. Most donors just say ceremonial for everything. So that also includes as the red flag. If you are familiar with your tribal nations in your area and they do have a museum or archive, please recommend that the donor contact them before they contact you. And a lot of this falls into that PNAAM, where it's gearing towards that PNAAM culturally sensitivity guideline that you see in this box here. So what we're also doing at ASU for Labriola, as mentioned, we are not just hitting, we are doing our distinctive or cultural reviews. We are expanding our protocols across library materials and services, because all of these information just does not impact archives. We get a lot of our instructors using our materials for their course. We are already doing some of the work with the IAL electronic reserve requests in our institution. After review, our student right now, Labriola staff students, are going through a high level inventory of each of the materials that we have. And there are, if you see in the photograph, there's an orange and blue bookmark. The orange signifies that it's culturally sensitive, and then the blue signifies misrepresented and inaccurate information about Indigenous people. So what we're working towards is these cultural sensitive material will have TK labels on these materials, and we will be replacing a lot of these books with the blue tags with more accurate information. So we're also going past that work there too. So some tips towards PNAAM implementation. Please review collections and make changes in real time. That will help speed up the process. Schedule collection reviews during slow days. This is right now, it's the summer. Jewel and I got a lot more review going on this coming summer now that the semester's, now that summer session is up. And then rewriting your policies and just focus one collection at a time. Also include non-MLS personnels into your work. And also understand that PNAAM is about undoing a lot of the colonial and library archival framework towards Indigenous information. So it is going to require a lot of work, and not to use that as an excuse. So, and I believe Jewel has some recommendations, and Renee too.
No, I will. The big thing is for the education for allies and the acknowledgement that you don't have perhaps some of the knowledge that perhaps maybe you should have. And so learning as you go and taking that learning and acknowledging that, understanding how certain Native people or Indigenous peoples within your vicinity may be harmed by viewing the materials. So being extremely conscientious about your positionality and where you are.
And I would add to be proactive when managing collections that contain Indigenous content, be intentional, be responsible, and it can be overwhelming, but taking the first step is really important. And it can't be ignored. Really needs to be addressed, as I said, in a responsible way with collaboration and partnership, and at least to review. As we've described, there are inaccuracies, descriptive terms, the images are not always described in the finding aid. So these reviews are really important.
So we are open for questions. If anybody has questions.
Yes, we do have some questions that have come in. I'll start with the first one, which is a question about if you would be willing to share the forms that you mentioned in your presentation for attendees to have access to. If so, this is something that we can upload to this session as a resource, if you would be willing to share those.
We're still drafting a lot of our stuff, updating. We're constantly updating, so I wouldn't give you a draft right now. But
Okay.
feel free to take some of the stuff that you saw and incorporate or create a form that works for you. So yes.
Okay. And we had a question: how do archivists balance the desire to have information materials viewable to the general public for research purposes with the access restrictions some of the tribal communities seem to have?
So that approach is we still go by with what the tribal community says. If it's culture restricted, it's restricted. We abide by that and we respect that. But oftentimes we do get people who want some sort of information. So what we do is we try to give them some resources that are very general, not in depth in terms of traditional knowledge, what's in there. A lot of the requests that we get, they're wanting to request traditional knowledge. They really want to go into depth. What does a symbol mean? I want to learn how to make that stuff, or I want to learn I want to implement it. We get a lot of requests that leads into cultural appropriation. So we only provide information that is very general and that's not very in depth with traditional knowledge. So if the tribe says no, we have to respect that.
Does the PNAAM inherently mean all Indigenous collections are item level processed?
Yes, because you're dealing with white collectors. This goes against a lot of what archivists are used to for arrangement, combining like leaving, moving stuff out of the collection. It will end up leading to that because a lot of these white collectors are collecting materials from different communities and it's combined as one. And a lot of these PNAAM does not work. One tribal's cultural protocols will not work for another. So we have over 500 tribal nations. That means over 500 tribal policies and procedures specifically with PNAAM.
How do you handle providing access to photographs of deceased Indigenous people? We have some photographs in a collection from D. Brown from his research for Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee that are pretty popular and widely circulated photographs from the massacre. But I worry about issues of privacy and consent around that. Do you think it would be worthwhile to try to contact descendants or to just restrict access? And they apologize. That was from Danielle. They apologize for the long-winded question.
That is a very good question, and that is working with the tribal community first. There are some tribal communities that do look out for their tribal members. So the best thing is just to reach out to a tribal community and asking those questions. So there's no one right answer for that. It really depends on the community. Just informing the community ahead of time of what these pictures are, the descriptions, and when you're reaching out.
Are there any differences or special considerations for handling interactions with tribes that do not have federal designation?
I would write, try not to use that as your guideline as a federally recognized that is a really another form of restricting a lot of materials to get back to communities. And please don't use that. There's a lot of tribal communities that are state recognized. There's a lot of communities out there that are not even recognized either at the state or federal level. So reaching out, and do not use that that term federally recognized as your guidelines to everything.
There is a question from Savannah. Do you have any recommendations for resources to educate ourselves?
The first step is, this is what I always say when I get that question is, again, a lot of our materials are on your bookshelf. That's one way to start, is stepping in there, is, again, a lot of our materials are in these library and archival collections. Research what you have in your repository, and get familiar with that, and then start reaching out to tribal communities and just building that relationship. And just getting to know some of the tribal members too that are in there, and also reaching out to your internal institution. If you're a higher education university, reach out to your American Indian Studies, department, or Indigenous faculty, or student or associations within that institution. We're fortunate to have our tribal leaders with our VP of Tribal Affairs, and he has a really good connection with our tribal community, things like that. Also reaching out to a lot of us Indigenous archivists and librarians. We are out there. You just gotta dig around or contact me. Yeah.
So actually, I'm skipping one question just to come back to how is the best way to sort of get in touch with you, or can we get some contact information that we could add to the resource tab, perhaps, in case anybody would like to get in touch?
Yeah, you could just email me. It's vina.begay@asu.edu, and then Renee is Renee, or share your email, Renee.
Sure. Renee.d.james@asu.edu. And you can find me going to the library homepage and do a search as well.
And mine is just jewelcummins@arizona.edu.
So we are almost at the top of the hour. So I will finish with one question. Did you develop a glossary of inaccurate or harmful terms and the respective replacement during this process?
Not yet, but that guide that we have was sort of that stepping stone to that glossary, I guess.
And I have notes. There's just not anything, like I have notes that I refer to as well. So it's just not anything official.
All right, well, we are at the top of the hour. So I want to thank everybody who attended, and thank you to the panelists for this wonderful presentation, and enjoy the rest of your day, and see you all at other sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.